Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Cole. It's early Sunday evening, November 2nd, and this is the Week 12 announcement for Political Science 3753 Constitutional Law for the Fall 2025 term. Everybody, I wanted to go over quickly what we have remaining until the end of the term. We've now done 5 out of 7 quizzes and 5 out of 7 discussions. So we need 2 more quizzes and 2 more discussions before the final exam. On the syllabus for this week, the week of the 3rd, we have freedom of the press, freedom of religion the following week, the week of the 10th. Then we will begin on 14th Amendment equal protection issues, largely racial discrimination, the week of the 17th before we take off for Thanksgiving. We will finish that up the last week of school, right at the 1st of December when we come back from Thanksgiving. I will try to get in a quiz and a discussion about freedom of religion before Thanksgiving. Then the last week of school, we'll do a quiz and a discussion on 14th Amendment issues. And that will take care of the quizzes and discussions for the term. Everyone, don't forget that according to the syllabus, you have to turn in a term paper to be on the A track for the course. That may or may not be important to you. You do not absolutely have to turn in a term paper, but if you would like to be eligible to get an A for the course, you have to submit a term paper. Now, you should have a lengthy list of Supreme Court cases that I hope will be food for thought when it comes to choosing a topic. I hope that if you plan to do that, you will contact me before we take off for Thanksgiving, no later than the week of the 17th. Okay? All right, so that is what we will be doing for the remainder of the term before the final exam. Looking at the material on freedom of the press in the class notes for lectures 21 and 22, some people think that freedom of the press is even more fundamental than freedom of speech. We often think of them as being very, very closely related. They're not exactly the same. It's important to note that freedom of the press issues in the United States go back to colonial times, especially the trial of John Peter Zenger in 1735. It was this case that helped to establish that the principle of seditious libel from English law would not be recognized in American constitutional law. Under the doctrine of seditious libel, the Crown could prosecute you for anything it regarded as seditious, even if the statements made were true. John Peter Zenger, in his trial, pleaded truth as a defense, and the jury carried out an act of what you might call jury nullification, declining to find John Peter Zenger guilty of seditious libel, and so that doctrine did not take hold in American constitutional law, which is not to say that sedition never once again became an issue, because we had, shortly after the ratification of the Constitution, the controversy over the Sedition Act of 1798, which was a piece of legislation promulgated by the Federalists against their Jeffersonian opponents. The issue over the Sedition Act of 1798 is often regarded as having been settled by the results of the 1800 presidential election in which Jefferson was elected. The act was never formally declared unconstitutional, but the election often is regarded as having settled the matter. Now, important precedents in freedom of the press include Neer versus Minnesota, 1931. J. Neer was a rather salacious Minnesota newspaper publisher. He accused the Minneapolis Police Department of corruption and did so with rhetoric laced with racist, anti-Semitic, and anti-Catholic overtones. So not necessarily a nice fellow, but he was prosecuted under a Public Nuisance Act. And when the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, it declared the Public Nuisance Act unconstitutional, thus establishing the principle of no prior restraint in U.S. constitutional law with regard to freedom of the press. Okay. You cannot prevent something from being published before it goes to press. Okay. If you have an issue, say, with slander or libel, okay, and then you act on that after publication, but no prior restraint. Okay. In the Stanford Daily case, 1978, the Stanford Daily, of course, is the Stanford University student newspaper. The case arose in the aftermath of a demonstration on campus that was accompanied by something of a civil disturbance. The authorities got a search warrant against the Stanford Daily and went through the premises of the newspaper looking for photographs pertinent to the disturbance that had taken place. The Supreme Court ruled against the Stanford Daily, but subsequently Congress passed legislation stipulating that in a situation like that, the authorities should issue a subpoena instead of rummaging through the premises of the publisher looking for a particular item named in a search warrant. Instead of doing that, you issue a subpoena, and then the burden is on the publisher to bring the item in question to court in response to the subpoena, so you don't have to have the authorities rummaging through the premises of a publisher. A couple of years earlier, we had the Pentagon Papers case. National security often will be invoked as a principle over and against freedom of the press. The authorities in the Johnson and Nixon administrations, most particularly, this would have been under the Nixon administration, did not want the Pentagon Papers published. They were documents about the early days of the United States involvement in Vietnam, going back to the 1950s and 60s. Okay. The Supreme Court ruled that the statute in question was overbroad and stipulated that such a matter was really what the framers of the First Amendment had in mind. So the court allowed the Pentagon Papers to be published, an important First Amendment precedent. Okay. Now you will see some material there about the free press versus fair trial issue. Okay. Looking at the class notes for Lecture 22, an important precedent in libel law is New York Times versus Sullivan, 1964. In this case, supporters of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had taken out a full-page newspaper ad in the New York Times criticizing the Montgomery, Alabama Police Department. There were some inaccuracies in the ad. Okay. So the people criticized in the ad sued. It was in this case that the Supreme Court laid down the doctrine of actual malice. Okay. For a public figure to win a libel action, private individuals had greater protection and more prerogative to bring a libel action than public officials or public figures do, in deference to freedom of speech. Public officials often are the subjects of political speech. So the Supreme Court raised a higher standard for a public figure or a public official to win a libel case. They have to be able to prove actual malice, which means either that the statement was knowingly made, knowing that it was false, or with reckless disregard for whether it was false or not. Okay, so for a public figure or a public official to win a libel case, they have to be able to show actual malice. Now, later on in the class notes for Lecture 22, we have a discussion of obscenity law, and you'll notice the Roth and Miller cases are discussed there. The most recent major precedent there would be Miller versus California, Miller versus California, 1973, which stipulates that to prosecute for obscenity, or to prevent the publication of obscene material, to establish it as obscene, you have to show that it appeals to the prurient interest under contemporary community standards, that it is patently offensive, and that it lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. Of course, that is all language that is subject to interpretation. It's a matter about which the court has been subject to vehement criticism down through the decades, the decisions it's tried to make in issues of obscenity. Okay. Can obscenity be prosecuted under the First Amendment? The most recent major precedent would be Miller versus California, 1973. That would be it for now, everybody. Later this week, in 5 to 7 days, look for an announcement regarding either our next quiz or our next threaded discussion. We'll try to get quiz 6 and discussion 6 in before the Thanksgiving holidays. Otherwise, freedom of the press on the syllabus for this week. Contact me with any questions, problems, or issues through the course website at the inbox or at david.cole@opsu.edu. Take it easy, study hard, and we'll talk to you once again about a week from now at this time.